education, where we got $37 million a year, plus another $50 million for special ed Title I that went out into the school districts. And in both cases, the Medicaid money and the education money, there was a peculiar string the federal government put on it, well, not peculiar, which was you can't reduce spending if you take the federal money. So you have to stick with the spending levels that you had in fiscal 10. Well, that's better than going up every year the way we had been doing. But it's sort of a pact with the devil as well, because when your problem is that your expenditures are too high, to accept money on the condition that you don't reduce the expenditures for years to come is a pretty bad deal. Fortunately, the federal government isn't really enforcing that because states like California can't begin to be where they were. The political reality is such that that simply can't happen. But taking the money, we knew there was a possibility that our costs were going to be ratcheted up because of the money we took. So was that part of the stimulus a success or not? I would say not, although there was a great deal of real pain that was avoided. The fact that it didn't succeed was at least as much our fault, Vermont's fault, as the Fed's fault. We could have taken the money, we could have begun on structural reforms faster than we did. Taking the money let us avoid beginning the structural reforms, and that was a mistake. There was a part of stimulus that was an absolute failure. And unfortunately, broadband was part of the part that was an absolute failure. Not one penny of the stimulus broadband money has yet been spent. The recession is supposedly over. The federal government simply wasn't capable of giving out the money as fast as it said. But stimulus had been promised. And stimulus promised and delayed is a depressant. And what happened is telecom projects that might have happened over the last 2 years simply didn't happen, because how can you go ahead and put your stockholders' money into a project when you don't know if the feds are going to pay for it, or even worse, if the feds are going to pay for your competitor to overbuild you? Nobody knew who was going to get the grants. Everybody applied for the grants. And so we had the absolute opposite effect. Jobs that would have existed didn't. Progress that would have been made in telecom and broadband wasn't. And still isn't. And we have an industry that went from being relatively independent, only relatively, to being completely dependent. When you talk to telecom people now, you say, why don't you build here, why don't you build here now, what's your plan? Well, you know, what kind of government aid is available and what kind of grant can I get? And these are just being good business people, because, again, there's a danger that if your competitors are going to get free money, you can't afford not to go after the free money yourself, because you'll be competing with somebody with a lower cost of capital. So that part of stimulus was a complete failure. But we're through with that part of stimulus. And we did recognize, even though we didn't recognize it enough, even though we didn't recognize it strongly enough in Vermont, and I mean collectively, it doesn't mean that there aren't people who said that we're spending too much. There certainly were. The governor was pretty strong on that. Some members of the legislature were, but collectively, we didn't recognize what the problem was. We recognized it some, and we started an effort called Challenges for Change. But before I get into that, let's get back to the business analogy. So we've got this overpriced product, wonderful product, but it's overpriced. And we've got to be able to cut our costs so that we can cut the price of the product. So with your business analyst glasses on, bifocals, not rose-colored, you look at what are the cost drivers. And there are 4 major cost drivers of Vermont government. One of them is simply inefficiency. It's incredible how inefficient the government is at delivering the services that the government delivers. Another one, and you heard plenty of well-informed talk about it this morning, is the black hole in the education fund. I won't talk about it anymore, but it's huge. The third, and I can see John McClowery making a note because he talks about this all the time, because he just got there before I did, is that the government is providing services that it shouldn't be providing in the first place. Is that what you were ready, John? Good. Okay. And the fourth problem that we have is tax expenditures that narrow the tax base. income sensitivity to property tax is just one of them. What we do is we say, well, this tax has gotten too high for certain classes of the population. The logical thing to do would be to keep the tax down so that people could afford to pay it. But instead, we start to exempt certain populations from the tax because they can't pay it or they're politically powerful enough to be exempted from it. When we do that, of course, then there's an even smaller tax base for what that tax is. And so the reduced tax base has to pay a higher and higher tax rate, which means we need more and more exemptions because there are less and less people who can afford to pay it. Until finally there'll only be one person left in Vermont who's paying tax, and she'll leave for somewhere else. That'll be the end of it. To be clear about challenges for change, it's only aimed at addressing two of those four cost drivers: government effectiveness and the black hole in the education fund. It wasn't meant to be a look at what services government should or shouldn't be providing. And many Tiger writers and others have said that we ought to be looking at that, and of course we ought to be looking at it. But Challenges for Change was basically saying, assuming that government is providing the right services, how can government provide services more effectively than it is? And by the way, what can we do about the education fund? I'm not going to talk about the education fund anymore because we totally failed in both Challenges for Change and the rest of the governor's program, with the exception of a few changes limiting income eligibility stuff on the property tax. We totally failed to get the legislature to recognize the educational problem. We have a huge problem coming in fiscal 12, but you've had other people talk to you very confidently about that. So even though that was a goal of Challenges for Change, we didn't do it. I'm not going to pretend that we did it. And let me talk about the rest of it. One of the things that we did find as we started to look, as I said before, is that the inefficiency in government is huge. There's enough savings there to go after. There's enough savings there that can make a considerable difference in the tax rate in the cost of government. One of the first ways that, as we started to recognize the depth of the problem and look for opportunities, Governor Douglas organized what were called Tiger Teams. I don't think they were named after Vermont Tiger, but maybe. And Tom Pelham, who's here, ran the Tiger Teams and did a fabulous job at ferreting out lots of places where government money was leaking out. Very deliberately, he was looking for leaks that could be patched in the short term because we didn't want the ship to sink this year. And he found a lot of those, and he was convincing, and his evidence was very good. And we put a lot of patches on it. And I don't mean anything derogatory about patches. The ship didn't sink. And we wouldn't have been able to balance the budget this year without that patching and without Tom's leadership. So Tom did a great job on that. We wanted to look also, intermediate and long term though, or what were the structural inefficiencies? How is this ship built wrong? How could this ship be built better? And what we found is that the state may be 10 or 15 years behind private business in taking advantage of technology so that it can serve better, so that it can perform its functions better. 15 years or so behind what private business has been able to do.